Hey guys, it's Rick. I'm going to show you today how to use your watercolor pencils and an inexpensive set of watercolors. So I've already stamped my images. I'm using the new Magnolia set, and I stamped it in a waterproof ink, and so I've let it dry a little bit. So I'm going to do my first one with the inexpensive watercolor set. So I'm going to need my small brush or smaller brushes. So I'm going to use my 4 and my 2. I'm not going to use the brush that came in this watercolor set because it's crappy. I've got my paper towel here. And the first thing you want to do is, where is it? There it is. You want to spritz your watercolors so they get a little wet. I'll wet my brush, dry it off a little bit. The thing you want to do is always think about your values, okay? So you're always going to be thinking about your values. All I'm doing is mixing up a different shade of green than what's in the palette. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, let me zoom in for y'all. I'm going to wet my paper just a little. I hope I've gave that enough time to dry. I'm going to come in. I'm basically just letting the water do the work for me mostly. This will take a little bit of time, but you can totally do it. Okay, now I'm going to come back over here with my first set of leaves that I did. I'm going to mix up a different shade of green. So I'm putting it in a lighter or darker value. And I'm glazing over that top one. I'm really following the lines that they have gave me with the stamp. clean off my brush and get just a damp brush. I'm going to soften my edges a little bit. And this is just a basic kids palette from the store. Nothing fancy. Okay, as you can see, I've done a couple layers there already and how different that looks already. So I'm going to go back in and mix up a little darker. I'm going to mix a little blue in. Just going to keep going. I'm dropping in, excuse me, a little bit more transitional color there. And I'm going to soften my lines out. And all you do to soften is like we did last week, and by putting the dark color in and pulling it out. Okay, see what a big difference that makes? So since our petal is overlapping, it's going to be a little darker there. And I'm going to drop in just a tad of a blue color right along the edge. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Drop in a little blue. Okay, now I got a little paint right there where I don't want it, so I'm going to kind of lift that off. So I'm just coming in with my brush and some clean water. I'm going to lift that off. So there is that. I'm going to dry this a little bit and check it. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So now I'm going to work on the white flower. And I'm going to do my magnolia white this time. So the trick with painting white is very light shades, and whites have color in them, okay? So in whites, you can see yellows, pinks, reds, blues, whatever is reflected around, or the objects around those white objects are going to be reflected into that white. So you're not going to have, no white is pure white, okay? So I'm going to do it kind of the same way. Make sure my brush is clean. So I'm going to start on this bottom petal down here and I'm going to wet it. So I'm going to do wet into wet. And I'm going to clean off the top of this lid in case I need to mix anything with this cheap little palette. So I think, because I want some sun, so I'm going to do some yellowish color. I think I'm going to add just a touch of orange with that. I'm going to water that down really good, which doesn't take a lot when you're using the inexpensive palettes. So I'm going to kind of drop in a little bit of yellow right there. On this side, because it's going to be a little cooler, I'm going to drop in a little bit of blue. Okay, I'm going to skip to my next petal and make sure I have no hard lines. So I'm going to soften that a little bit. Let's do this one right over here. So I'm going to wet my petal. I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to drop in just a little bit of the yellow. Soften that up just a little bit. Tad bit of blue. In that shadowy area back there. And this time, I'm going to just drop just a little bit of red. And I can also, since that petal is right there facing us, I can drop a little green in our petal. Okay, you see how light that is? That's about a level 9 or 8 or 9, and it's going to dry back lighter because remember, your paints will dry lighter. Okay. I'll go over here to this petal because you want to paint where your petals are not touching. Okay. So I'm going to drop in a little yellow right there. That was a little too much. Tad bit of warmth right in here. We got some green going on. So I'm going to drop in just tiniest bit of green. And drop in a little bit of blue in our shadowish areas. Okay. So now I'm going to skip to this petal up here. Okay, I'm going to drop in my yellow first. Just like so. And then over here we're going to drop in the little blues because they got a petal on top of a petal. Sure I have no hard lines. A little bit of warmth in there. Okay, I've already got this going on right here, so I'm going to go with that. Again, I'm going to drop in a little warmth in our shadow areas. Now my highlights, I'm keeping white of the paper, okay? Okay, so I'm going to work on the other petals here. So I'm going to wet this one. I'm going to go ahead and start with my shadow area. So I'm going to drop in my bluish color. And I want that to be just a tad bit darker, so I'm going to add in a little bit more purple. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, then we're going to add a little yellow up here. A little reflection off that leaf. Okay, we're going to come to this petal. And have a little bit more of a warmth to this one because the light's going to be hitting it a little bit better. Drop in the yellow. And on this inside, it's going to be a little darker. There's going to be a shadow there. And just a light shade of blue. A little too dark. Soften that out. Okay, here we go. Now I'm going to dry this one. Let me get my head out of the way. Shari, I'll come back and answer your question after it's over. I wanted y'all to see how you can use different medias to get the same effect, and you're going to concentrate on glazing as part of your assignment. But you're going to use an inexpensive watercolor palette, no re-inkers, just a cheap Crayola watercolor palette, and your watercolor pencils. You're doing two different cards, the same design. Okay, now, if you can see, it's still white, but there's a lot more color and punch in that white. So now we're going to make it really look white and intensify the shadows, okay? So I'm going to come in with a violet for my shadows. And I'm going to mix the yellow in with it to create a neutral, more of a gray neutralized shadow. Okay, so I'm going to start in my shadow areas. Too light. You're still in your range of about this would be about a 7 to 6 range. Okay, now I'm going to soften my line edge out so that I don't have a harsh line. Now at this point, I can come back if I need to and drop in just a little bit darker color to give me a little darker shadow up there in that very darkest part. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and do this one. A shadow in. And when I paint shadows, I have a tendency to follow the shape above it. Yes, white objects can have some nice intense shadows. So you've got to pay attention and not let it get too bold too fast. This is where you're going to really pull in from what you learned last week about pulling out the color. Okay, I'm going to do my center. Okay, so there's the center. Now, if you really want something to look really, really white, put a dark color beside it. So I'm going to paint my stem before we do that. And I'm going to add a little bit of this blue up in there, because blue and brown are red is a orange. It's an earth orange, so they actually complement really well with blues. Okay, so I'm gonna need a nice bold color, as much as I can get with this palette. As I get away from the flower, I'm going to soften those a little bit more, because I don't have to have all that black right in there, or dark blue. I really want to concentrate that more around my petals. A lot of water, just softening that edge, letting the water do the work for me. Okay, now notice how darker or how much lighter that flower looks compared to that dark background. Okay, so I'm gonna let this dry and then I'll end up turning that into a card. Now, I want to show you how to use your watercolor pencils. Because these can also not only be used as for just coloring everything. After you do your watercolor painting and you need something that might be just a little bit darker or intensify color, you can come back in with your watercolor pencils and do that. Ow. I slipped. Okay, so basically what you're going to start out doing is coloring. And the thing with watercolor pencils are, the more heavier you color, that's the more pigment you're putting down on the watercolor paper, okay? So if I want something to be really dark, I'm going to press harder. And then as I get lighter, that pigment is going to get lighter. I'm going to get a little darker right there. Make sure I have plenty of pigment to manipulate. Okay. In some of my shadow areas, I'm going to add some purple, which is rich raspberry from my watercolor pencils. For my flower center, I'm going to use Daffodil Delight. Right in here, I'm going to add just a little bit of Pacific Point, which is my blue. Okay, and then I'm going to color my leaves. add just a little yellow, like it's been kissed by the sun. I like to do all my coloring first and then come back and move my pigments, because then I can see where might need a little bit more, a little bit less. Okay, so I'm going to take a clean watercolor brush. It's kind of, the more water you have on here, the more it's going to move. So I want just a very little. I'm going to pull it out. Okay, I'm going to move on to the petal over here. Because we're not working in the same area. You're going to do a petal, skip a petal, like you normally would paint. Do an area, skip the next area so that it has time to dry. This is where the heat resist technique would come in really good, because you could not have to worry about what petal you're doing. My nose never starts to itch until I get on camera. Okay, now at this point I would let it dry completely. This is a 4 that I'm using right now. So I mean, it really depends on how your brushes are, because my 2 is smaller than my other 2. This is my 2 in this kind of brush. My 2 in my other brush. Okay, those are both 4s. My 2 in my other brush that I have is like in between a 2 and a 4. It's more like a 3. Just kind of depends. Okay, so that is the watercolor pencils. Now I'm going to turn this into a card in a minute after it dries. There is the watercolor with the cheap watercolors, the inexpensive watercolors. And mine are Royal Nickel. I picked them up at Dollar Tree for $1. But actually, they're really good paint. I was kind of surprised. There's Crayolas that's really good to do that with. But I want you to do a card. I want you to do the same card, same stamped images, but one using the really cheap, inexpensive dollar set of watercolors. And then the other card, I want you to use your watercolor pencils and make 2 cards that are the same, but using both those medias. One with the cheap watercolors, one with your watercolor pencils. And then post that in the comments below. And that's your assignment for this week. Try painting a white flower. Remember, go back and watch the video and how I did that. Okay? Talk to you later. Bye.